I want to talk a bit about business cycles, what they are, and what their significance is to macroeconomics. When we talk about business cycles, this is something that's familiar really probably to all of us. Most of us are aware of the fact that the economy just doesn't go in a straight line upward over time. That is, if we plot a GDP as a dollar figure over some sort of time series, no matter how far back we go, it's not going to be linear, that is a straight line. It's going to have ups and downs, it's going to have waves. And I don't mean this particular example here to suggest that these are all that predictable, as it might be illustrated here. Sometimes we can predict them, sometimes we can't. We're often very much surprised. One of the things about economists that is concerning to some is the fact that we're not always able to predict when a downturn is coming or where the bottom is and where the top is, and so it is something that is a challenge, although there are signs, and the macroeconomics world has done a much better job over time at trying to at least determine where these inflection points are, these changes. And as these inflection points, again, if we talk about GDP on this axis, time on this axis, we know that we've got certain periods in which we reach something of an expansion. And when we talk about this particular thing, with rising GDP over time, we simply refer to that as what it is, as economic expansion. And notably, one key part of this is in the early stages of a comeback, right after a downturn in the economy, we specifically refer to that period as a recovery. And there's no clear answer as to what the time period is between when a recovery ends and when a full-on expansion happens. But we know that's what's happening, okay? So growth in GDP over time is an expansion. But what about a drop-off in GDP? What is that? We've got a very specific term that's familiar to all of you, and that's recession. And a recession is a fallback in GDP, and in most of the industrialized economies, we have a very specific definition for a recession, and that's a decline in real GDP for at least 2 consecutive quarters, a quarter being a 3-month period. If we have 2 of those in a row, we have a recession. And recessions can be sometimes longer and deeper than others. Some recessions are not particularly long-lasting. The 2001-2002 recession was about 7 months in duration, 8 months depending upon how you measure it. And as a result, that was a pretty shallow and short recession. Others, such as the 2007 to 2009 recession, deeper, a bit longer, and was certainly more problematic in many different ways. So expansion and recession. There are also 2 other elements we should talk about, and that is, when I talk about inflection points, talking about tops and bottoms, and these are notoriously difficult to call, and that is when an economy has been going through an expansion phase and is about to top out, we simply refer to that as a peak. And oftentimes, like so much in macroeconomics, all the information, or the vast bulk of the information that we're using as historical information, oftentimes we don't know we've come to a peak until sometime after the fact. And the same can also be said, for that matter, for recession and expansion. We don't sometimes know. So that's another stage. The other stage is trough, and that is where the economy has bottomed out in the short run. And from there, the fall in GDP has been arrested, and now the economy is ready to build back up, to go into a recovery, and then to go into an expansion. And so as a result, what have we got here? We've got a case in which economic life sees ups and downs of the business cycle, the growth in GDP, the fallback in GDP, and as a result, we don't have always a very predictable world in which we live. This is, I think we can all agree, one of the more problematic aspects of economic life is the idea that we really don't have any kind of good expectation as to what's coming in the future. We do much better when it's a few months, a few weeks ahead of time. I think economists can feel much better about their forecasts, but if it's many years in the future, economists notoriously don't always do a very good job. And in fact, over the years, some forecasts have been wildly inaccurate. So it's difficult. And if you look to economists to tell what the future is, I think one rule of thumb is it's easier to tell what's coming in the near future than in the distant future. Okay, having said all this though, we shouldn't get too discouraged about economic life and the work of economists, because here's one thing that we can say with a fair degree of certainty. And if we go back on this and there's obviously some limitations as to data collection and the technology and the ability to go around collecting data. Obviously, we don't have very good data going back to years like 1850 or whatever. There are some estimates and whatnot. 1900 becomes problematic. It's only just around the beginning of the Depression, around 1929, that the data get very good. And after World War II, the data collection becomes very good indeed. And so if we take this out now, let's just say to 2010, for instance, along this time scale, one thing that we can say is that since the Great Depression began around 1930, 1929, 1930, that macro policy has come into its own. And I know we haven't really talked about macro policy yet, but this is where we're going to be revisiting the very idea of business cycles, and in particular talk about what economists do, what they can do. And there has been some relative success, and that is this idea that at one time the economy was much more wobbly than what it is today. And as a result, and maybe I could draw this a little bit more to the current day, as a result, one thing that we've seen happening is this, that stabilization policy, which I'll define a little bit more concretely in subsequent videos, is the government policy directed toward trying to stabilize and monitoring the business cycle, where once it was much more volatile, taking those oscillations down, getting higher lows and lower highs, so that the impact of these wild gyrations is moderated, while over the long term, the economic growth, as denoted by this hypothetical green linear function here, is still on an upward trajectory. And there's a lot of evidence and a lot of support for the idea that given our system and an ever-growing labor force, an ever more productive economy, one that uses lots of capital goods and technology, that we should and can often be able to expand the growth and output over time. And note, while we still have these oscillations above and beyond this sort of natural growth rate, okay? So one final thing about this is the idea that we could have differences between the actual and the potential of GDP. And so when we have a difference between actual potential, actual potential, actual potential, we have what's known as a GDP gap, also known as an output gap, and that's simply the difference, the distance between actual GDP and however it differs from what we call potential GDP. And potential GDP will be further defined in the next video as being full employment GDP, and that will link it more to the issue of employment, particularly labor employment. But nonetheless, we can see that we can remain on an upward trajectory that might not be this easily construed as being totally linear, but nonetheless we can have movements above and beyond in the short run, as up to this point we've not yet outlawed the business cycle, despite a great deal of success in at least trying to moderate it. And so in the next video I'll talk more about this idea of the gap in GDP, in particular linking that to output and employment.